state officials, contractors during the time of torture, right? So what we have to have here is a combination of at least two elements, right? We need a combination of at least two elements. The first element that we need is we need to satisfy the condition of custody, right? Custody has to be satisfied. The second element that we need is an intentional infliction, right? The point of the act of torture, if we're attempting to classify an act of torture, if we're attempting to satisfy the condition for torture, there has to be a sense of intentionality. Right? There has to be a sense of intentionality. And then we have to have the physical, psychological, PSY. Oops. Right? We have to have the physical, psychological abuse, right? So it's important to recognize that we have to have the physical, psychological abuse. With respect to the notion of torture, this idea of custody plus the intentionality of the physical, psychological abuse in order to get data, right? Really, information, quantifiable, qualifiable, qualitative data in order to do X. Primarily, it's usually set in terms of security interests. It could be, and we'll see in a second, it could be retaliation or retribution for some offense. It doesn't always have to be a tool of interrogation. This is expanding, strengthening, reinforcing our conception of torture, especially attempts to make distinctions, at least conceptual distinctions between torture and acts that look similar to torture, but don't classify, that can't be classified as torture because one of, or more than one of these conditions haven't been met. And as I said, the example of domestic violence isn't classified as torture, though the sadist might be, the spouse who's abusing the other spouse might be doing exactly the same acts because the condition of custodianship hasn't been satisfied. Number 4, the act of torture is internally legitimized as an act of national security, right? And there's a citation from that. I gave you a link to a piece that I found on the Harvard Law website. So the act of torture is internally legitimized, right, as an act of national security. And remember, we said that with respect to any individual particular torturer, he or she might have to psychologically overcome the very act that he or she is performing on a detainee. So insofar as he is engaged in an act of torturing another human being, he might reframe that, right? This is a sort of an act of self-deception or self-coercion to say, well, remember we said that interpretive denial is one of the 3 categories of denial of torture. So what ends up happening is a torturer, through the processes of interpretive denial, denies the fact that the act that he's engaging in torturing this detainee is an act of torture, and reframes it in terms of forced coercion or enhanced interrogation or whatever, advanced blah, 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 right? So it's sort of a semiotic, right? It's very psychological semiotics, right? You've psychologically allowed yourself to participate in the act by reinterpreting the nature of the act. Now, as I said earlier, this isn't, it would be wrong to say that all people who participate in acts of torture need to go through sort of this psychological coaxing, right? They're sadists in the world, and they would willingly torture someone just for the fun of torturing someone. They're very obedient people in the world who are given orders to do something, and they do it knowing full well what they do. But there's varying degrees of co-opting individual participant and participation in acts of torture, and that varies. If I were to do like a really full-blown analysis, I would flesh that out more, but this is introductory, so there really isn't any need to go into any more detail, because that's more on sort of the acts of torture rather than sort of the relationship between torture and human rights. So for internal legitimacy, right? internally, right? It's internally legitimized, right? So 4 was the act of torture is internally legitimized as an act of national security. Hence, the act of torture is justifiable. This is a really sort of simple utilitarian ethic, right? Or utilitarian calculus. Torturing one person might save the lives of, 500,000 people. Therefore, insofar as I torture this one human being in order to save the lives of 500,000 people, my actions are legitimized internally by sort of the utilitarian calculus. And then I participate in the act and reframe the act rather than an act of torture as an act of enhanced interrogation, and so on. So that's conceptually the manner in which this unfolds. Number 5, emphasis in distinguishing torture from other abuses of power primarily rests on the notion of custody, right? So again, this idea of custody becomes a seminal concept. Right? This idea of custody becomes a seminal concept in attempting to assess and analyze the complications involved in the systematic, intentional, and willful torture of detainees for national security affairs, retaliation, retribution, what have you. Number 5 still, quote, for example, this is a quote from Human Rights in the World Community, page 85, quote, for example, being beaten while being arrested changes from cruel treatment. I think this is a good example, right? For example, being beaten while being arrested changes from cruel treatment to torture only when custody has been achieved, right? Custody becomes a seminal concept, and it is the attainment of custody. It is that act, once custody has been attained, that constitutes the act of torture. So I'm going to give you a really simple example that everyone will be able to understand. The key distinction. So, not to bring up old stuff, because it was a pretty horrific time in American history. I remember I was in college at the time. I think it was 94 or 95. I had just started. Rodney King beating is televised all over. Obviously, the trial goes, and you see the video of Rodney King being beaten, right? And I remember how I felt when I watched it. It was like, oh my God, I mean, merciless beating of this guy in the middle of the street, right? And you see him getting beat, and from what my perception was wow, I don't know if he was resisting arrest, I don't know what's going on, but it was like 4 or 5 cops beating the sense out of this dude. So that is definitely, in the act of being arrested, cruel treatment. That act, however, as brutal as it was, and it was brutal, justifiably so or not, was not an act of torture. If Rodney King had been detained, fingerprinted, processed, and brought into the penitentiary system, and exactly the same beating, and received exactly the same beating, so that the nature of the beating had not changed at all. He received exactly the same amount of strokes, he was in exactly the same position, the participants were exactly the same, it would have constituted an act of torture. So what's important to recognize is not the physical infliction of pain that's important in assessing the distinction. It's the fact that he was not yet in police custody, which did not qualify the act as an act of torture. Certainly it was an act of cruel punishment or cruel treatment. It was a cruel treatment, but it wasn't an act of torture because the police hadn't yet detained Rodney King in the example. So conceptually, hopefully that makes sense as to the threshold. There is no threshold problem with analyzing torture because it's clearly defined the instance the individual is detained by whoever has the capacity, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be government, right, per se, right? Contracted militia, paramilitary, civilian people who have the capacity to detain people and put them into custody qualify as potential torturers, right? So that's the first, right? So custody, again, and hopefully that example shows you the threshold at which it constitutes an act of torture. So if you were to think of it, we have custody here. We have custody